Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Congressman Mark Takano. Congressman, I really appreciate you coming on today.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure, Brittany.
In the wake of a school shooting in Nashville that killed 3 students and 3 adults, you, along with your colleagues, Senator Ed Markey and Representatives Elissa Slotkin and Marilyn Strickland, introduced the Gun Violence Prevention Research Act. Can you give us a little highlight about the legislation?
So, Brittany, I'm really pleased to be here. The legislation, in short, that I'm authoring along with Elissa Slotkin and Marilyn Strickland and Senator Markey, has to do with increasing the funding and continuing the funding for the Center for Disease Control to research more deeply the causes of gun violence in our country. It's a uniquely American phenomenon. The numbers of Americans that are dying by gun violence and the numbers of young people is just astronomical. And this is one thing I think that we can get Democrats and Republicans to agree on, that we must have a more laser-focused understanding on what is driving this gun violence in America.
I do want to talk about the bipartisan nature, hopefully, of this bill, but something that you said, this is a uniquely American phenomenon. This is not the first time you used the phrase uniquely. This is what you said about the bill in the past. As a country, we must seek to understand why this violence is rampant and further research why America is uniquely experiencing a crisis of this magnitude. Why do you think this is unique to America?
Well, as someone I believe was very clear-eyed about it, we have a fascination, a kind of fetish for weapons in our country, and why it is, I don't think that enough Americans or enough members of Congress or even that there's just not a broad understanding or a consensus about what is the cause of this. There are maybe historical reasons for this. There's the Second Amendment, of course, the structure of our laws, the way that there's a deeply embedded conviction among many Americans that they have a right to own weapons. But the idea that people would not just own weapons, but weapons that can kill mass numbers of people, automatic weapons. This sort of, this goes beyond defending hearth and home. This goes beyond hunting. There is, in my view, a level of irrationality in terms of the level of gun ownership, just the kinds of guns that people want to own. Now, my point of view, obviously, is is shared by many, but not by all, and we're very polarized and divided over this. But I don't want to overstate that either. Overwhelming numbers of Americans, 80% or more, say they want better laws. They want universal background checks. They want to see loopholes in the law which allow people to buy these extraordinary weapons at gun shows. They want all these things closed, but we haven't, as a political system, been able to get to that point. The people who believe strongly in gun ownership and the ownership of very destructive weaponry, they have an outsized voice. But there are, beyond the ability of us to get the political system to work on behalf of the people, we have, I think, a duty to try to come to consensus with each other on to find common ground where we can. And where I think we can find common ground is let's research objectively. Let's use the power of science to understand gun violence more. Let's study it deeply. And an example of this might be, we know we can see patterns in terms of who is behind or who is involved in mass shootings. But mass shootings aren't just the only thing we need to study. Mass shootings constitute just a really small minority of the number of gun deaths in our country. Way more Americans just die from other kinds of gun violence episodes.
Something that you said that stuck out to me was you want to find common ground. I spoke with Senator Ed Markey, and he said the same thing. And he really thinks that this legislation, at least the research portion, Republicans can get on board with. He said this about the legislation: if people are afraid of the research, they're afraid of what the consequences would be. What do you think those consequences of the research will be? What do you think Senator Markey meant by this?
Well, Senator Markey, I don't want to get inside Senator Markey's head and put words into, attribute words to him. Let me just speak for myself. I mean, the research could tell us the centrality of the easy availability of guns, and that the solution might involve somehow restricting access to assault weapons. That could be a conclusion, but I don't think we should jump ahead of the research. I think we should fund the research. The research may tell us other things. It may tell us ways in which we can address teenagers and preteens, and that there are things about the maturation process, the emotional maturation, the mental maturation of young people, and how that relates to gun possession, how that relates to the access of weaponry. We may be able to fashion public policy in very strategic, laser-focused ways in which we, find a way to live with the Second Amendment, but the science may give us the tools to fashion laws which are, far more focused and not overly broad, which is maybe something which may enable us to find more common ground with one another.
This legislation would fund the CDC $50 million each fiscal year for the next 5 years. So that's a lot of money. That's a lot of time for research. Do you think more legislation will be born out of this research?
I think very well. I mean, often the precursor to good legislation is information, is data, is analysis. I can remember in 2016, being on the floor with John Lewis out of frustration. Mr. Lewis and my friends, David Cicilline and Catherine Clark, who is now our Democratic whip, they began a sit-in, and I began to live stream that sit-in from my phone after the Republicans turned off the lights. Democrats were just so frustrated. And why were we frustrated? The nation had just seen and witnessed this horrific Orlando shooting at the Pulse nightclub. I had forgotten that was the impetus, because since then we have seen so many more shootings, mass shootings. And there have been other shootings across the country which don't even make the news because they're not mass shootings. But the truth is, most Americans who die of gun violence are dying not of mass shootings. They're dying from shootings that happen on a routine basis all across the country. But I remember learning that there was an impediment to even research. The law since 1996 had prohibited research from even being done at the Centers for Disease Control. And it wasn't until the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress in 2020 through the appropriations process that the CDC received $100 million, I think, over 5 years. I might have that number wrong, but there was a restoration of funding in 2020. What our legislation seeks to do is to increase that to $50,000 per year over 5 years. That's $250 million. And I think, this is this is what is possible in the moment. We've already done it once in 2020. So I believe we have a good shot at being able to get this done this year.
Congressman, you brought up the Pulse nightclub shooting back in 2016. I know that story very well. It was actually the first breaking news story I've ever covered as a journalist. But a criticism that lawmakers really get is there's a lot of calls for action after a giant tragedy like that one. You can name various American cities where shootings have happened. Calls for action, and then the news cycle moves quickly on. Why do lawmakers, Democrats and Republicans, always reach that impasse? And it seems like there are tiny trickles that get done, but not leaps that Americans want to see.
Well, I can point to one thing that I think is very significant, and that is our legislative process is the Senate has to get to a supermajority in order to end debate. And that has always put the brakes on responding to the immediacy of a horrific gun violence episode. The moment that the nation is focused and ready to see Congress act, the way the Senate is constituted, 1/3 of the Senate is elected in any given election period. And so the other 2/3 of the Senate, those folks that oppose gun safety legislation, they'd simply know that the heat of the moment is going to cool down and pass, and the American public and the news cycle is going to move on. And so they're willing to continue to accept the donations of the gun lobby, and I'm speaking mainly of Republicans. Republicans not only face the gun lobby in terms of donations, they also face a significant part of their base in primary elections. And so think about who turns out for primaries. It's not the majority of the community. It is a segment of the Republicans that turn up. But those fervent gun rights folks, the extremists, they have an outsized voice in those primaries. And so the 2/3 of the Senate that's responsive and feels they are afraid of a primary opponent, they're also afraid of that. So, but I do believe that a fix is to address this issue of the filibuster. That when it comes down to just a majority vote in the Senate, it's much harder, I think, for there to be a situation where just a bare majority of the Senate is not possible. We need to, I think, do filibuster reform. But short of that, we're going to continue to see the Senate be an instrument of delay, obstruction, but delay and forget.
Where do you think filibuster reform talks are at right now?
The filibuster has long moved past any kind of credibility of good government. There's some arguments for why you want to drive filibuster. You want a filibuster because the argument is that you're going to get a bipartisan result. But largely the filibuster, in my view, has become an instrument of obstructionism, and it's gotten in the way of America being able to move forward. And we need to take, I would rather take the risk that, the opposition party, my Republican colleagues will get the majority and will take advantage of a majority vote. But I have faith that the American people are going to be the ultimate brakes on extremism, that the filibuster has not been a brake on extremism. To the contrary, the filibuster has become an instrument of extremism, and the evidence is in the failure to do anything more substantive about gun violence in our country.
Congressman, I do want to move on to where the GOP support is specifically on your bill. Obviously, all of the co-authors, including yourself, are Democrats. But when I spoke to Senator Ed Markey about 2 weeks ago, he said he is trying to get Republicans on board. He hasn't yet, though. How has that endeavor been going?
Well, we've just introduced a bill. I have ideas about certain Republicans I can approach. Guns are, a very difficult issue for my Republican colleagues, but there are a number of Republican colleagues who represent districts that President Biden either came close in or won. And, I think those Republicans are some of the Republicans that we first ought to engage in conversations. But I also think that the idea of research should be something that would appeal to more Republicans than even Republicans that represent close districts.
Democrats and Republicans, obviously, for years now, have had differing views and ideas on how to keep communities safe from gun violence. The Safe Students Act, reintroduced after the Nashville shooting by your colleague, Representative Thomas Massie, would repeal the Gun-Free School Zones Act of 1990 and, quote, would make it easier for state and local governments and school boards to unambiguously set their own firearms policies. Is this a type of legislation that you would support?
I would not. I don't think, what that legislation suggests and what it is aiming toward is the idea of arming school officials, arming security officials, but arming teachers, arming other maybe administrators. This, I think, is a crazy idea. I don't think that schools will become safer because teachers are packing heat. The idea that I certainly, as a teacher, I was a teacher for 24 years before I became a member of Congress. I can say that a teacher has a lot going on. And I think the last thing the teacher needs to be expected to do is to somehow have a firearm in the classroom or access to one. Would the teacher wear it on their person? And I can just imagine a number of scenarios in a classroom where a teacher wearing a firearm and other students knowing about it would be a potential situation, a very dangerous situation. I have concerns about a teacher's, the way in which firearms might get used. We've had concerns about police shootings. I don't think we need to introduce another element of social division where a shooting occurs at a high school or middle school, and there is an element of racial bias that might enter into all of this. There's a whole heck of a lot of considerations that have to be given to what it would mean for school officials to quote unquote make a school safer by allowing teachers and other school personnel have weapons on their person.
When I've talked to your Democratic lawmaker colleagues, they've all said that they've wanted, the ones that I've specifically asked, wanted an assault weapons ban, but they hoped that that wasn't a non-starter for Republicans. Do you think hardening schools is a non-starter for Democrats?
Well, if hardening schools means to arm teachers, to arm administrators, I don't think that's a great idea. I think better to make schools and their surroundings gun-free zones. That's a better idea. I think having red flag laws be implemented that we can identify, have red flag laws be part of a strategy to have citizens come forward when they know that somebody is mentally unstable and has weapons, to have those weapons be at least temporarily separated from that individual. I think we have other strategies that we can put in place in lieu of arming teachers, and arming teachers and school administrators and school personnel is, I think, just an ill thought through, knee-jerk sort of reaction to extreme ideologues who do not want to face up to the fact that the easy access to weaponry is the source of our problems, and the solution is not to have an arms race. So if hardening our schools is an arms race with people who have guns, that is the logic of that. Just the logic of it, I think, is wrong.
Congressman, from what you're saying, it sounds like what you want of this legislation is this isn't the end-all be-all, but it's a good first step in addressing gun violence in our nation. Representative Strickland as well as Senator Ed Markey both have the same sentiment. And as we sit here right now, according to the Gun Violence Archive, there have been at least 162 mass shootings in this country in the year 2023. And since they have come to the agreement that this legislation is not enough to immediately stop the mass shooting cycle. So what do you think is?
Well, I do think I've supported and voted for an assault weapons ban. I think having universal background checks. I think having, I think closing all loopholes in terms of who gets sold weaponry. I mean, loopholes meaning any kind of loophole in the law which allows people to buy weapons outside of a background check. Anyone who buys a weapon should have a background check. And that background check needs to be given enough time for authorities to be able to look through the databases to find out if anybody has anything in their history. If they have a criminal history, they have a history of spousal abuse, any kind of violence, that is an indication that that person has an issue with, control over their emotions. And we should be very, very wary about someone owning a weapon with an anger issue or with some sort of emotional explosiveness. That's why we need to be researching carefully. Anybody who buys a weapon, they should have to go through a background check, and there shouldn't be any ways around that check. My recollection is that most of the gun safety advocates believe that universal background checks with no loopholes could be the most effective thing that we do. Short of limiting weapons in a more, more restrictive manner. But we do have a Second Amendment. We have to sort of balance what that means. So I think, and most Americans, overwhelming numbers of Americans support universal background checks. Do we need to make sure that the databases are fair, that there's ways to appeal? That's all part of what we got to do to make sure that people are being treated fairly. But we have to open our eyes and recognize the fact of the mass shootings you just mentioned. They're occurring, and there's hardly any place to hold, any place to hide. There's no place to hide, and this retreating by the other side behind this idea that we're going to solve this by hardening schools, or in other words, having an arms race, promoting an arms race between teachers and would-be mass murderers. This is not the way forward.
Congressman, something you did say is we do have a Second Amendment, and when some Americans hear phrases like limiting weapons and an assault weapons ban, they immediately think that's an infringement on my Second Amendment right. What's your response to that?
Well, my response to that is that when Justice Scalia wrote the Supreme Court opinion, which found, this is before he died, and this is in the aughts, I can't remember the exact year, but the Scalia opinion found that individuals had a right to protect their hearth and home. That was not an opinion which said that you can carry your weapons anywhere you want, and you had a right to defend yourself outside your hearth and home. And Scalia left open the possibility that assault weapons could be regulated. He did not establish in that opinion, and nor has the Supreme Court since then said that the government can't regulate assault weapons. So it's in another world right now. Some states have moved ahead with making the way in which you can carry the weapons around more and more liberalized. They've instituted stand and defend laws, which if you perceive yourself to be in danger, that gives you the right to use your weapon and diminish the level of liability you might have to suffer criminally or otherwise civilly. I think these are very dangerous laws. They kind of rely on highly subjective kind of judgments about when you're in danger, and it imposes it kind of creates a kind of vigilante mindset that people can take the law into their own hands. They can take another person's life if they feel in danger. I mention all this because a stand and defend yourself kind of law is far different than what Justice Scalia wrote about in terms of you have a right to own a weapon to defend home and hearth. I disagree with the Scalia opinion as well. I don't think it was necessarily the case. It is necessarily the case that the founders believed in an individual's right to own an assault weapon. A little less clear when it comes to sort of, say, the rifle that was common during colonial days or in the early parts of the Republic. But assault rifles didn't exist at the founding of our nation. They didn't. And so Scalia, being an original constructionist, an originalist about the Constitution, I think he was wrestling with that.
Congressman, before I let you go, I do want to ask you, what's next for the Gun Violence Prevention Research Act?
Well, what's next is to, I think, get more co-sponsors of the bill, to build public support. I think most members of the public like the 80% of Americans who believe in universal background checks, would say this is a very common sense thing. Why isn't Congress doing it? And I think we together need to make expanding research at the CDC as to the origins of gun violence in our country, an issue that is too hot to ignore. Not just only too hot to touch, but too hot to ignore. And that is what moves contentious pieces of legislation through, is when the American people make it very clear to the representatives that we expect you to do this. We have to focus enough attention on it to just say, to make it clear that this is too hot an issue to ignore.
Congressman Mark Takano, thank you for coming on.
You're welcome. Thank you.